Welcome back to the Download Show. Today I'm joined once again by Professor Brian Wong, philosopher, Rhodes Scholar, and now the author of a powerful new book, Moral Debt, Defending a New Account of Reparative Justice. Now, if you've seen Professor Wong on the Download Show here before, you know he doesn't shy away from the big questions, and this book is no exception. In it, he argues that moral debts don't disappear with time. Descendants inherit claims. Inheritors, whether individual states or institutions, inherit responsibilities, and reparations remain a live question, even generations after the original wrongs. Now, we're going to unpack the framework he calls collective moral debt reparative justice, explore its strengths, its critics, and even stress test it on some of today's hardest questions, from Israel and Palestine to beyond. Professor Wong, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Tak. Really appreciate it.
Now, congratulations again on the book. If you can hold it up for the audience, for everyone to purchase, and we'll actually have the link in the description below. Thank you very much. Now, you did develop this concept, again, collective moral debt reparative justice. Could you unpack that for us?
Thank you, Tak. This is, I want to start by just sharing with you a personal anecdote. And that is, a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of watching a movie called Dead to Rights. And in Chinese, it's Nanjing Zhao Xiangguan. And what it effectively does is it depicts the horrors, but also the complexity and the nuances of the horrors. The humane and rather multifaceted interactions between human agents during wartime China, in the face of Japanese cruelty and the wanton aggression of the Imperial Japanese Army. And as I was watching the movie, I was reflecting upon the book that I'd put together. How do I explain collective moral debt in a way that's reasonable and accessible to laypersons? Honestly, it was a challenge. And it was especially a challenge whilst I was trying to consume and also, really immerse myself in the horrifying but also deeply touching scenes of that very movie. Harrowing is perhaps a better word. But there were two conclusions I arrived at, and these two conclusions are going to guide me as I explain this framework. And the first is, I'm going to try my best to shy away from jargons, from terms and nomenclature that we philosophers love using, but end up basically confusing 99.9% of people, and with good reason too, because frankly, sometimes we philosophers, we like to operate in an ivory tower, and that's very discombobulating. The second note that I arrived at is I want to talk about lived experiences. I want to draw upon stories and anecdotes to ground what I mean by the collective moral debt or account of reparative justice. And so on that note, what exactly is my proposition or proposal here? There are four core components. I'm going to try and condense them into 1 minute each, okay? And I hope you'll bear with me if I sort of spend a tad longer than I promise, so to speak, in explaining this framework. The broad problematic that I'm engaging with here is the ubiquity of historical injustices throughout human history, from the transatlantic slave trade through to genocides perpetrated by ethnic majorities in countries such as Rwanda, but also by totalitarian regimes in Pol Pot, Cambodia, and the Khmer Rouge. History is rife with injustices, and yet we are often told that we ought to forgive and forget, and to move on and to let these sleeping dogs lie. I would beg to differ for the simple fact that historical injustices are also enduring injustices. They shape not just the distribution of welfare and opportunities in our present generations, but also how our present generations conceive of themselves and imagine their relationships with the past, with their ancestors, with their roots and cultures, but also in relation to the future. And that is why this account seeks to address this fundamental problem that is empirically extant. It is not an imaginary problem, not a figment of imagination, but in fact something that's very much alive and real and plays out across the world, not just in relation to, former Western colonial empires and former colonies of the West, but also, of course, in many parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia as well. So the first proposition I have in this account is essentially that historical injustices were primarily wrong, and we should focus on the wrongness as opposed to the harm undergirding historical injustices when thinking about why we ought to care about and for them, so to speak. So why this emphasis upon wrong and not harm? Very simple, because there are numerous instances where historical injustices did not in fact result in all things considered harms. And all we need to look at here are examples like Singapore and Hong Kong to an extent, where of course colonialism was deeply, deeply unjust and also, discriminatory, bigoted and alienating, especially in the first 100 years of its manifestation in colonial Hong Kong. And yet by and large we get a lot of voices saying, but Hong Kong benefited on net from colonialism. Hong Kong was a net beneficiary from being under purported British rule. And to these critics, I would say one thing. You guys missed a point. Because when we say that historical injustices are worthy of our concern, we're not talking about benefits and harms, costs and benefits, add them all up and tallying them. That's the wrong approach. What we ought to look at instead is whether or not there was wrongness involved. And I would say there was. From the expropriation of land and the seizure of land from the hands of the indigenous villagers here in Hong Kong, to the brutalization and also violation of the rights of those who fought back against the Brits during many a war of resistance or battle of resistance in the new territories, and of course subsequently, down the line through sort of underground activities. And finally, through the racial hierarchy that was perpetrated and normalized throughout vast swathes of the colonial period all the way up until the final, say, 15 to 20 years. These were all wrongs. And such wrongs percolated and accrued throughout Hong Kong, even despite the presence of clear benefits. So on one hand, I confess and I admit, I perfectly accept that colonialism probably did bring Hong Kong, on balance, more benefits than harms. But that did not therefore mean it was justified. It did not therefore mean it was not wrong in any sense of the word. And that is the first premise of my argument. Based on this, then, what I argue arises uniquely between perpetrators of historical wrongs and victims of these wrongs is a moral debt. And whilst I start off essentially by looking at individual agents, so Bob or Susan or Kathy, just as hypothetical characters, we'll see why this becomes applicable and germane on a collective level as I move on to my fourth proposition later on. But that's the first proposition unpacked there. The second proposition is to observe that the victims of these wrongdoings, right, they have the right to transfer, to bequeath their moral debt to their subsequent descendants. Hold on a second, you might think, what do you mean by bequeathing debt? How does that work? Well, the first observation I'll note is that in the status quo, we already do bequeath a lot of things to our descendants. We call it inheritance. I could pass on a house, I could pass on $1 million, I could pass on shares in my corporation through a trust fund or otherwise. And indeed, it is not that much of a stretch to say that I can also pass on promissory contracts, right? So if you say, Tack, you say, you owe me, okay, $100,000, and yet I am I suffer from a sudden cardiac arrest, and I say, Tack, please transfer the $100 to my daughter, and then I die. Well, my request is still binding, because essentially I'm demanding that you repay a long-standing debt you owe to me, but merely that the stipulated debt, the beneficiary from the repayment of the debt is no longer myself because I'm dead, but instead my descendant, right? And I would say that the same logic could be transferred and applied to the moral debt in hand here. That a victim of historical injustice could say, okay, maybe you're not going to compensate me whilst I'm alive. Maybe you're going to do, jack all essentially and decide to walk away from this, but you are still bound. Just because this is not enforced or enforceable, you are still bound. Does not mean that you're not bound by the responsibility to repay me. And by extension, when I die, upon my cessation of existence, my next of kin, my stipulated inheritors, my heirs, so to speak. And on this front, I also add in additional observations concerning why children might have unique claims to the parents' moral debts, even if the parents do not stipulate as such, right? And much of this has to do with, of course, the intimacy and how integral, essentially, one's ability to access and retrieve one's parents' moral debt is to one's own identity formulation. And I want to preempt here the challenge that I'm encouraging a victimhood complex, because no, I'm not suggesting that these individuals who lay claim to the ancestors' moral debt are thus victims. That is not what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting here, though, is that the initial victimhood and the injustice that results in said victimhood, if left unaddressed, is not superseded by time. Because it would be deeply, deeply bizarre and counterintuitive to say, oh, I murdered someone, but in 30 years' time, because thanks to the passage of time, so be it. If I'm a murderer, I can walk free. I don't need to do anything. That strikes me as deeply implausible and frankly normatively irresponsible. So that's the second prong of the debt account. The third prong then is what I call the inheritor pays account. And that's where we look at, of course, the perpetrators, right, who accrued this debt. Suppose the perpetrators die. Suppose the perpetrators pass on, okay, then there are no perpetrators left, right? And the objection that we often get is, hey, look, the past wrongdoers, the sort of evil colonels who were brutalizing and killing, prisoners of war during the Holocaust in terrible concentration camps, committing these atrocities, well, they're all dead now, so we can't hold the SS accountable. It's pointless dwelling on the past. That is the argument that we often hear when it comes to, of course, egregious, heinous, historical injustices such as the Holocaust. And yet to these critics, I would say, just because the SS colonel's gone doesn't mean that their descendants are gone. And in fact, chances are many of these perpetrators of historical injustices will leave behind estate, leave behind inheritances in both physical forms, say objects, estate, titles, but also in intangible forms. Case in point being reputation, or social networks, or trust, or social standing. So my observation there is that the descendants who come into possession of these goods, of these tangible or intangible goods they inherit from their ancestors, would also develop essentially subsidiary responsibilities to redress these injustices and to redress the wrongdoings committed in the past, not because they're guilty, not because they're blameworthy. And I deliberately eschew talk of blame and guilt following the footsteps of Iris Marion Young, a brilliant social and political theorist, but because they are just responsible in a forward-looking and forward-oriented sense in relation to remediating or remedying such injustices. And that ties me on to the final prong of my account. And I'm conscious of time, but this is where the collective comes in. Because recognize that throughout historical injustices, it's not individuals who are the primary perpetrators of such injustices, whether it be the partition of India, which you could attribute to one single political leader, a certain nobleman's decision. Even then, it's a more complex picture than that. You've got a sprawling, behemoths bureaucratic machine that implemented the decision to partition India to the extent it counted as an injustice. But more viscerally and more apparently, if you look back at all the injustices perpetrated in mass mobilizations of people, fueled and driven by impetuous, passions, whether it be in terms of the Rwandan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, the Myanmar massacres against ethnic Chinese and persecution of them under the military junta. All of these episodes we're looking at here, right, Tak, they really involved collectives, from the British EIC, East India Company, all the way through to the various colonial armies settling and grabbing lands in a race and a scramble for Africa. Again, collectives, not individuals, were at fault. And so the final step in my argument is to say that instead of holding just individual agents responsible, we ought to adopt rigorous, but still encompassing rules of responsibility assignment to also hold responsible collectives who are perpetrators of injustices. And in turn, we could also argue that collective descendants of victims, as communities as a whole, are entitled thus to reparative justice, not just individual descendants who are most intimately related to the individuals at hand. So that's essentially the argument, and I'm sorry for taking so long. Thank you.
No, not at all. So let me push back a little bit. So the debt, thank you for that large kind of explanation, comprehensive. Now, my first point is debt suggests kind of ledgers and payments. Do you worry that this framing might be make reparations sound too transactional and too financially motivated?
Excellent. So this is a fantastic question and one I had to tussle and grapple with extensively. I'll start by explaining why I think debt is so powerful, and then I'll deal with your objection directly. My first comment here is to say that debt is powerful because it intuitively captures a sort of stickiness of the relationship, right? For instance, if I say offense, well, offense is transient because you might have offended my mum, but my mum and I are different individuals, we're separate persons, and therefore offense is not carried across generations. Alternatively, we might invoke the claim of a fundamental violation or infringement upon our core identities, and that's why colonialism is so wrong. But if so, what then explains my right to bequeath, let alone the right to my descendant to inherit some claims from me? Now, of course, you might listen to this and think, well, am I not begging the question? Am I not therefore assuming the debt logic and therefore invoking the debt logic, so to speak? And to this I would say no, because I supply independent reasons for which the debt logic stands in the case of reparative justice. And more importantly, I think it's we have to recognize that ultimately political theorizing is about persuasion. So if you're not persuaded by this account I'm offering here, I'm sorry, and that's my failure. But on the other hand, if I can give you enough reasons to believe in the compelling force of this debt metaphor, independently or otherwise, into which I can go into certainly more detail subsequently, then I will have succeeded, even if, of course, I am indeed assuming to some extent, debt-oriented intuitions as I invoke the debt metaphor. So that's just something I want to highlight as a preface. The second comment is an answer to what you're saying there, right? Why this sort of financialization? Is there not a worry that you sort of quantify and over-quantify the what's at stake in reparative justice? And here I would note that reading, whilst plausible, rests upon a very narrow and perhaps excessively definitionally constricted way of looking at debt. So I want to use a Cantonese saying here, right? Because I'm a through and through Hong Konger, so I'm going to just invoke this phrase called 人情債. Yan Ting Zai, is Yan Ting Zai something that we... Okay, for those of you who don't speak Cantonese, Yan Ting Zai basically translates loosely to sort of, a compassionate debt, or a debt of, right. Custom. Not even debt of custom, but it's more almost like a social interaction generated debt, right? I owe you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, social. That's right. A social debt.
Social debt. Okay. I don't have to repay the social debt through paying you money. I don't need to, I don't even need to technically repay you in a manner that is quantitatively identical to what you did for me, right? Because it would be very strange for you to say, hey, you owe me one, but you didn't repay me exactly what you owed me for, right? That's a very lame way and bizarre way of looking at social interactions. And as such, therefore, in these cases, across both English and Cantonese, debt is already invoked in the status quo to capture something that is more than just strict transactions and strictly quantifiable relationships, okay, and responsibilities and obligations within that. Now, of course, the pushback is, no, you're still taking this through a sort of quid pro quo, I give you something, you give me something manner. Isn't that the wrong way of looking at how humans relate to one another? And here, again, I would make two suggestions. The first is to say, this is a very instinctive part of human nature, right? It would be very bizarre to say, you invade, you raid, you ransack my home, and then I'm going to say, yeah, you don't owe me anything. Bye-bye. Right? To forgive, of course, could be very powerful. To forgive could be very noble, but I'm under no obligation to forgive. The Chinese people are under no obligation to forgive what the Japanese did to them. The Korean people, the same could be said for them. And indeed, I would say the Japanese people are under no obligation to forgive what occurred to them in terms of the innocents killed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or indeed those who arguably were victims of and also lost out under the radical transformations that came after the Black Fleet and also the Meiji Restoration in the second half of the 19th century. This does not therefore mean that they have, these grievances of theirs could be justifiably turned into violent actions. I'm not defending that. I'm not defending the arson and the riots and all the assaults on Japanese property in 2012 in China, which I also condemned. But I'm saying merely, all I'm saying here is that there's no duty to forgive unless the conditions, are ripe and are satisfied. And there are very specific conditions for that, so to speak. So I do not think, this charge of our being too transactional necessarily holds much water. And throw into that, of course, the further comment I'm going to make here is I don't want people to see this debt-based account as purely transactional. And that is why when it comes to discharging one's moral debt, I've explicitly stipulated you could discharge this debt by committing to opposing future injustices, by doing something about present and future wrongdoings, right? So perhaps it's very hard for you to compensate as someone who benefits perhaps from the Japanese nationalistic or ultra-nationalist far-right complex. It's very hard for you to compensate directly the victims of the conflict women that were abused in the past in China or South Korea. But what you can do at the very least is to call out and to challenge the sort of erasure and, frankly, dereliction, right, of duties to repair over conflict women within the Japanese mainstream discourse. And there are lots of very brave and bold women and also men actually in Japan today who are doing just that and challenging imperialist thought and challenging revanchism rooted in nostalgia for the imperial era in the Japanese contemporary history, so to speak. And that, I think, is rather important. So that's my answer to your question.
Now, that's a really good point, segueing into, I think, the situation in Korea and Japan, because isn't there a kind of a risk of this moral debt being weaponized politically, turning into a justification for ongoing, let's say, aggression and intention rather than a path of reconciliation?
Very good. So, two thoughts there, or maybe three as we proceed. The first thought is to say this drive towards aggression and drive towards nationalistic irredentism, and indeed, instigating and stirring up, right, the troubles of the past. This exists independently of the moral debt account, right, and it exists because of descendants of perpetrators refusing to acknowledge history, because of descendants of victims opting to, again, weaponize nationalism to achieve domestic political gains and victories. So to the extent we're worried about this phenomenon of weaponization of the past, it's not of the moral debt account that we ought to worry about. It's not the delta contributed by the debt account is quite negligible in that front. If anything, I would say, the background force is already there, and the account merely provides, at best, another vehicle for their manifesting, so to speak. But the second comment I'll say here is, in the status quo, especially if you go and look at a lot of mainstream conservative accounts in, say, the West concerning historical injustices, I want to bring back colonialism and transatlantic slavery and slave trade here, right? A lot of these accounts expounded by self-anointed conservatives, okay, even though there's nothing conservative in my view about, the violation of private property rights and also bodily autonomy, but what have you. These conservatives would say, hey, colonialism did a lot of good for these people, and we wouldn't complain about what happened there. Insert an article published and then redacted or retracted from a particular journal and say, this article is, of course, a very compelling piece defending the virtues of colonialism. Blah, 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 blah. In relation to these accounts and in relation to these voices, what I've often said is the fact that, yes, I think descendants of victims and communities of descendants of victims should indeed have the right to and earn and leverage a discourse to contest these frameworks, right? Because the status quo discourse is not one where post-colonial reparations or rectificatory justice or accounting for past wrongdoings is accepted. If anything, the Overton window over the past 8 years is shifting once again towards the we haven't done anything wrong, why should we apologize? Just look at Donald Trump and MAGA as an instance, an example of that, or the sort of rise of the new right in Britain as another example of that. Now, of course, those of you listening back at home might say, oh, well, Brian, you're missing out on a broader picture. Surely these voices are just reacting to the ultra-woke and ultra-lib movement who basically called for tearing down statues left, right, and center and cancelling anyone who's to the right of LBJ. And I have no qualms about criticisms of these certain voices, fringe voices going too far, which I agree. I agree that these fringe voices have indeed gone perhaps a tad too far in over-prosecuting and over-indexing cases of injustices. But that does not therefore mean that erasing injustice and embracing, indeed, injustices that took place in the past is therefore the way to go. And this is where I would say, if my narrative can indeed be utilized helpfully and constructively by voices who need the narrative, would benefit from the narrative, whether they be governments or indeed activists or indeed politicians, so be it. And I think that's actually, broadly speaking, a positive contribution towards the dialectic concerning colonialism, concerning historical slave trade and abuses, and also what we ought to do with questionable historical figures in the present day. But of course, all of this is said with a final caveat that I do worry about moral debt being co-opted unduly by non-victims, by folks who are not descendants of victims, by communities who have not been victimized, and who instead decide to use moral debt to serve their own ends, right? In saying, oh, look, for instance, the white African community and Afrikaans community in South Africa, of course, they've suffered, members there and segments of that community have suffered, dubious treatment at hands of the post-independence ANC government. That's unquestionable. But to jump from that to the claim that the white population is purportedly oppressed in South Africa, despite all the underlying complexities and long-standing hierarchies and also socioeconomic inequalities, I think that's a bit of a stretch, right? And thus what I do worry about, of course, is when you get folks appropriating moral debt discourses. And perhaps the South African case is less clear-cut, and I apologize if I offend any white listeners in South Africa. But let's take another example, right? For instance, the white nationalists who fueled the MAGA movement. They sort of argue that the economic woes that they've suffered, which, as we explored in the previous episode, Tack, had much more to do with the Nixon shock and the Triffin dilemma than to do with other countries. They sort of felt that their troubles and their woes had to do with unbridled immigration, had to do with the so-called illegals coming from Mexico, or indeed affirmative action programs that favored non-whites over whites, hence all the sort of white replacement theory conspiracists out there, right? And in these cases, I would say we've got to be very cautious about the weaponization of moral debt in a manner that does not do the concept and also the idea of justice, and in fact creates or exacerbates existing inequalities and tensions as well. But how can we gatekeep prudently? How can we gatekeep accurately? That is something that I don't have a good answer to, and I hope to explore in future research and writings as well.
So actually, let's segue more into the real world. So what has been the reception and criticism actually of your framework and your concept in the real world?
So since my rolling out the account, I've had the distinct fortune and privilege of having been contacted by senior advisors to a number of governments in CARICOM and also in ECOWAS, so regions in respectively Latin America and also West Africa, who have expressed interest in sort of taking on board this narrative, in shaping and framing the way their governments and their countries ought to think about the relationships with the global north. And what I said to them was, whilst I welcome and I'm very appreciative of their interest in the accounts, I would caution them against, and I would once again caution everyone here listening back home against the over-reductionist essentialization of the moral debt account, and also the committing of the very same errors that Tack you highlighted just then, a deliberate, disingenuous simplification of the picture at hand that asserts because we are owed a moral debt, therefore you ought to give us a free pass. I've warned my friends that either they'd be complicit in, or in fact they'd be actively perpetrating these narratives if they were not cautious. But at the same time, I also said to them, I really do think and I really do hope that the moral debt claim and account as a whole could serve as a powerful rallying cry, deployed effectively and positively to advance the development of a more egalitarian relationship between the global north and south going forward. So that's one point. In terms of criticisms, though, there are two, and I want to deal with them sort of, fairly and seriously, because they are valid criticisms. The first is the worry of overpopulation, which I'll explain shortly. And the second worry is the idea that essentially this creates a trade-off, a trade-off with present generations' rights, and that present generations' rights should overweigh, right, or be weighed over and supersede the claims pertaining to past injustices. And this is actually a claim that's advanced to some extent by Jeremy Waldron, who was a brilliant political theorist in his own right, and also someone that is incredibly persuasive. Sorry, I meant he is. Okay, so he is a very compelling political theorist.
Right.
Sorry, I was thinking about when he wrote the article. That's all. Okay, so let's perhaps start with the overpopulation claim. And overpopulation here refers specifically to the overpopulation of responsibilities. That we would give rise to too many responsibilities, right? And the usual sort of flow of logic goes as follows. Brian, you talk about moral debt. What about Alexander the Great? What about Genghis Khan? What about the random Egyptian pharaoh who abused his slaves? Are we going to deal? Do we have responsibilities to settle all of these moral debts? That's pointless. This is ridiculous. That's the argument, right? So what do I say in response? A couple of things. The first is to observe that there are clear feasibility constraints on a prosecution of moral debt. We can't prosecute, we can't account for, we can't settle all moral debts, because most of them, for all the reasons that those examples and intuition pumps sort of highlighted there, these instances are not cases where we can actually trace and identify moral debt and parcel them out meaningfully. Who's the descendant of Pharaoh, Rama the First? You tell me, right? And maybe you could argue that
I'm sure somebody is,
the
but
Egyptian
yes.
population, right? But then we'd be taking too diffuse and coarse-grained an approach to identifying inheritors to the point where I don't think this account can actually hold. But saying that is one thing, right? But then moving from that to instances of, say, the Sino-Japanese War and saying, oh, I don't know who the descendants of the victims of the Sino-Japanese War were. I've no clue. That seems to be a rather reckless move that is disingenuous. Because I can tell you this, I, myself, okay, I'm a descendant of someone who was victimized by the Sino-Japanese War. My grandmother, on my dad's side, lost half of her family, very large family, including aunts and uncles and all that, to the Japanese. and she had previously, prior to the war, been someone who lived with in a pretty comfortable upper middle class or middle class family, and yet subsequent to the war, she lost everything, including both her parents. So I can tell you this, right? We can find descendants, we can find heirs. And I didn't write this book because I wanted to justify my receiving anything from my friends in Japan. That is not the intention. That was not the intention. But instead, what I do want to highlight here is that it is not true to say that you cannot identify present-day living descendants and also their ties and connections with past injustices, and the same could be said of both perpetrators and inheritors, or perpetrators and victims of the initial injustices, so to speak. The second observation I'll make is reparative justice is only one amongst many considerations that we ought to take into account when coming up with our, everyday principles of morality, and also how we govern and how we interact with others. The distributive justice matters, relational justice matters. We ought to think about what's consequentially, in terms of, for the lay person, what brings about the most good for the most people, where good is amorphously defined. All of these are relevant and germane parts of our everyday morality. Reparative justice is only one part of it. It's like, if you go into a golf course, you've got different kinds of clubs, right? You've got larger clubs, you've got smaller clubs, you've got longer, shorter, what have you. I'm not an expert golf player, so I apologize if I'm butchering the sort of terminology here, right? But in short...
Woods and drivers.
Exactly, yes,
Woods
precisely.
iron.
Something to get things onto the green, and then others to just give you the sort of wide tee-off shots, right? So you use different tools to achieve the same end outcome. And that's something I would say is analogizable and akin to the way we interact with ethical frameworks. In reparative justice, there's only one amongst multiple frameworks. If you say to me, Brian, everything you said is kosher, is good, is brilliant, but I think something else is more important, be my guest. I'm not going to challenge you. I'm not going to say, no, you're wrong. You're awfully wrong. But all I'm positing here is we need to think about reparative justice before concluding. Either it is important, but it's outweighed by other considerations, or, you know what, I'm going to act in accordance with its prescriptions and pursue, whatever is indeed most conducive towards reconciliation. And here's where the final response to the overpopulation argument kicks in, right? Surely, the variant that we often hear, as a response to everything I've said is, surely, even if I granted everything you said, how can you decide between Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and also the Japanese invasion of China? Which ones of these do you prioritize? And my answer to that is very upfront. We prioritize whichever ones are the ones in which we can do the most or make the most progress in relation to reparative justice. It is futile trying to cry over, spilled milk that was spilled 4,000 years ago, because I don't know where the milk has gone since. It is far less futile and actually pretty productive to think about the spilled milk yesterday or the spoiled milk 1 week ago. So of course we've got to be pragmatic and sensible whilst implementing this proposal. And that's why I don't think the overpopulation claim is particularly powerful, even though I do acknowledge its intuitive force, certainly amongst more conservative circles, so to speak, in relation to colonialism, for instance. It would say things like, well, if we're going to punish folks, which, by the way, I'm not punishing folks, but if we're going to punish folks for what their ancestors did 500 years ago, then what about all the cannibalism and slavery that went on in this part of the world, also in the past? And I would say to that, well, look, if we can prosecute justice over that, let's do that too. But remember here, two wrongs do not make a right. Just because slavery was indeed implemented and adopted in certain parts of 10th to 13th century Africa did not therefore justify the transatlantic slave trade, right? Making that argument is a bit like saying, oh, look, there's another country that's fighting a war, that's invading another country. So I can also invade another country. Let's invade these countries together. That, to me, is an absurd and fundamentally debasing claim to make in a context of international ethical argumentation. So that's my set of responses to the overpopulation worry. And just very quickly on the present generation's rights.
Yes. And
this is how the argument usually unfolds. Brian, you talked a lot about moral debt, but let's face it. America is in deep trouble today, rampant inequalities, identity wars, cultural wars, and Europe, we're not doing well either. There's an invasion on our doorsteps and our economies aren't growing as fast as we'd like. There are worries about immigration. Are you honestly saying that we ought to think about our responsibilities towards the past and put these responsibilities over our responsibilities towards our contemporaries? That's the question that I get. And to which I would say, firstly, no, I'm not saying that. Right? I'm not suggesting that reparative justice trounces or trumps our duties towards contemporaries. And in fact, there might be contingent reasons why present generations matter more. We interact more with them. There's more that we could do to help them. We benefit from the injustices that they're suffering under in terms of victims of injustices. We're connected to them via sharing the same political community. I mean, these are all reasons why I would personally put, distributive justice claims over reparative justice claims. But that doesn't therefore mean, right, at any point in time, that argument therefore implies that reparative justice is irrelevant, full stop. None of these arguments means that we don't care or shouldn't care about reparative justice. It just means that we have to put reparative justice into perspective in a context of other competing moral claims and start weighing them and comparing and contrasting them and asking ourselves, which of these should we care more about? And of course, what we then realize, Tak, is that in many instances, there's no strict trade-off, right? It's a bit like saying, oh, if I'm getting the apple pie, I can't get the mango custard pie. Well, no, you can get both, right? It's just a matter of how full you'd be. Now, if you're very full and if you're on cups of throwing up, then of course you can't get both. But if you've still got, plenty of bandwidth, right, so to speak, in your stomach, then you can order all of that and also order a cherry pie on top. So again, we've got to be more flexible and also fine-grained in relation to what isn't mutually exclusive. In instances where resources are very, 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 very scarce, of course, we have to make trade-offs. But chances are, in 90% of circumstances, we can do both. We can care both for the victims of the past and for the victims of the present. We can care both for descendants of the victims of the past who are not necessarily themselves victims, as well as our compatriots who may not be victims in their own right at present. Indeed, we can care about past generations and also future generations as well. And one of the questions I set my undergraduate students last year for a finals paper is a murder committed 10,000 years ago as morally bad as a murder committed 10,000 years into the future? And when I wrote that question and set that question, I was actually listening to Leonard Cohen's The Future, which was a beautiful, beautiful song. Right. And of course, he said he's seen the future. It is murder, right? Give me Stalin and St. Paul, he croons. And so I was deeply touched by that line and inspired by him to pen that question for my students to answer. It was a very open-ended essay question. There was no mark scheme or anything. I just wanted my students to try and defend and take up a position that they wouldn't usually do in response to a question they wouldn't usually think about.
Actually, a slight tangent. What was one of the most kind of interesting responses?
There were no responses because they could choose. So no student chose that question.
No one wanted to grapple with the issue.
No, they all opted for safer essay options. There were more, I guess you could graft something onto it. There was more room for them to draw upon what they already had learned as opposed to sort of, applying unfamiliar theories. But then it was an open book exam anyway. So, if they'd wanted to do it, they could have done it anyway. Interesting.
Again, kind of real world test, but you're a good segue as well into future states. If we take a look at this framework with the current conflict in Israel and Palestine, where do you think, is it a pretty kind of open and shut case based on the framework? I think it's restorative justice should be seen as one club within the golf set of whenever the Palestinian state arises to make claims, or do you think there is something slightly more complex, I think, with that current conflict that could add or challenge your framework?
It's an incredibly complex situation, and I want to just start by saying that my heart goes out to, of course, those who have lost their loved ones on October the 7th, all the terror attacks prior to then, but my heart also goes out to the tens of thousands of individuals who've languished in the war, who have died, right? Many of them are innocents. They're not terrorists. They're not insurgents. They're innocents. And that's the sort of moral tragedy of our contemporary zeitgeist and our era, undergirding our zeitgeist in our contemporary era. I am deeply, deeply struck by the argument that fundamentally only when you have political sovereignty and statehood, could there be international recognition and protection of the rights of individuals on the ground. And I personally have always agreed with a view that whatever is going on today in Israel demands, at least in its purest form, in a theoretical sense, a two-state solution where the rights of the Palestinian people are fully recognized. Now, there's a tendency to conflate what I said there with a justification for terrorism. But I want to be very clear here. I do not advocate or support terrorism against any people. Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, really, we cannot conflate these positions, right? Just because we support a two-state solution and also a right to organize and respectable self-government, that does not therefore mean that we support violent destruction and sabotage of the order and the infrastructure of Israel as also an independent sovereign nation state. But of course, Tak, and I think my answer would not be satisfactory to some of you listening back at home because you think, why can't I say something more bold and radical? To hell with X or to hell with Y. But the reason for that is because this is not just a historical injustice question. This is also a question of territorial integrity and sovereignty, a question of post-independence governance and what that's going to look like in an independent Palestine, but also, of course, of domestic politics in Israel. As I warned in a BBC appearance 3 months ago, I really think that the incumbent in Tel Aviv right now, or more specifically, a certain individual in that administration, for a variety of domestic political reasons and parochial incentives, is driving through and prosecuting a war against individuals who have done nothing, to earn the starvation, the malnutrition, and also the deaths that have been inflicted upon the people. And that, I think, is something that I really want to highlight, and with a preface that I'm not an expert on what's going on in Gaza and also Israel at large. I don't claim to be an expert. In my public commentaries, I've usually emphasized the need, again, for a two-state solution that's enforced by international observers and also respect for the rights of both peoples. But I do not claim to be an authority on this matter. So thank you for that thought-provoking question, though.
On closing, you said this book is both, quote, an academic inquiry and a personal journey of self-discovery. So through the writing of this book, what have you discovered about yourself?
I used to think that I was a pretty, a staunch, Anglophile, especially prior to going to the UK. And I'd always thought, Sir Humphrey was a role model of mine. And I'd grown up listening to David Bowie and, the Beatles.
You also mentioned Chris Hitchens in there, so I figured that was probably...
Chris Hitchens, a bit of Chris Hitchens. Me? I got to meet his brother, by the way, but I have never had the pleasure of meeting Chris Hitchens.
Peter, yes, I've never met either of them. But
I've met Peter. But long story short, there was a real sense of Anglophilia. But when I arrived into the UK, I realized three things. One, all that seemed to be golden was not necessarily, in fact, golden. Two, racism was not only real, but also very much perniciously shaping the way histories are narrated and framed, in this sort of belief amongst many in Britain that their rule over Hong Kong was a golden era and that Hong Kong after 97 was somehow, doomed or destined towards irrevocable decline. And finally, I came to the realization upon studying, the more I read into, the more I looked into Hong Kong's colonial history, but also British colonial history and, of course, Chinese history, the more I realized, it is not the case that this civilizing mission narrative that we were sometimes, in some cases fed, and sometimes we sort of inferred and observed from the works of art we consumed, that this narrative was pretty bogus, that there were many holes to poke, right, in this story. And thus, throughout my undergrad years at Oxford and also my first year in my MPhil, I sort of switched and pivoted from one end of the spectrum towards a pretty, staunch opposite and extremity on the other end, where I basically said, look, I think the British Empire was terrible. They did terrible things to Hong Kong. Let's not romanticize the empire. Let's actually confront its excesses and atrocities, so on and so forth. And whilst I'd always held views that one could describe as perhaps more pro-status quo and pro-establishment in Hong Kong, prior to my arriving into Oxford, a lot of that was fueled by my being an Oakeshottian conservative and a skeptic towards democracy at large. But subsequent to that, I came to realize that actually, setting aside all of one's valid grievances and legitimate criticisms of the status quo back then in Hong Kong, politically speaking, even if we were critical of the status quo, we could not and should not adopt, colonial narratives, right? And that's why I wrote that SCMP piece in 2018, talking about how we oughtn't conflate criticizing the Hong Kong government or maybe criticizing Beijing with, blind erasure and frankly, an overlooking of the wrongdoings and aberrations of the past in order to fit this contemporary agenda to try and push forward here. Then, of course, in the subsequent few years, I once again sort of mellowed somewhat, and I came to recognize, of course, the perils of anti-colonialism, post-colonialisms being co-opted and weaponized by certain states and leaders, especially, of course, in Central and, to a lesser extent, Western Africa in a sub-Saharan context, right, to prosecute their own agendas that were not necessarily conducive at all towards the welfare and interests of the people. And I also came to recognize or appreciate that we could disentangle the harm and benefit discussion from the right and wrong, or wronging versus righting sort of distinction. And so I guess I finessed and nuanced my argument throughout the process of writing my MPhil, which in turn was a prototype that spurred and provided a basis for my current book, Moral Debt: Defending a New Account of Reparative Justice. And that really is the personal thought process and journey that I've undertaken. And of course, in the first few pages, or 10 pages of this book, I also talk a lot about my own family story and how deeply intertwined we were with all sorts of historical injustices. Starting first, of course, with the British, of course, acquisition of Hong Kong via the Opium Wars, of course, in 1842, Eliot then Pottinger, then subsequently the invasion of China and of course Hong Kong by the Imperial Japanese Army, and then after that, of course, the complex dynamics of decolonialism, or the gradual retreat and also to some extent withdrawal, right, of the Brits prior to 97, when handover or the reversion of sovereignty occurred. And of course, throughout this journey, right, of Hong Kong, but also of my own recollection and understanding of my own family, I came to realize that it's very hard to put a sort of straightforward monochromatic label on many of these injustices, right? Yes, it's true that all of these episodes of colonialism, of warfare, of invasions, they were morally abhorrent in their own distinctive ways. But had it not been for such a turn of events, I wouldn't be here today speaking with you, Tak, in August 2025. I wouldn't be debating the intricacies of the moral debt account with you over this podcast, so to speak, right? So, this is how life and also history works. It takes us in very unexpected directions. And we cannot alter history. We cannot change the dynamics of what happened in the past. But what we can at the very least do is to beat on ceaselessly into the future, as opposed to, the past into which we might find ourselves borne back by the tides of the Great Gatsby. So that, I guess, is my response to your question there. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor Wong.
Thank you.